So, have you ever wondered how to tell if your podcast is doing good or not, or how to know if your podcast is quote unquote successful? So, in today's Ask Angie, I am answering a question about how to know if your podcast is performing well or quote unquote successful. So, stay tuned.
What's up? I'm Angie, and you are listening to Podcast That Pays, the podcast for online business owners who want to grow their business and sell their offers using podcasting. If you like no fluff, tell it like it is advice from a marketing-loving podcast agency owner, you are in the right place. So glad you're here. Let's dive in.
Okay, what's up, fam? Welcome back to another Ask Angie. And this question comes from my Facebook group. And inside my Facebook group, I actually asked a question and I was asking, what are your biggest struggles when it comes to your podcast? And Stephanie actually responded and asked, how do you even know how to evaluate how good your podcast is doing besides downloads? So if you know me, if you listen to me often, you know that I don't care about downloads. And I think I just wrote a post about this on Facebook not too long ago about why downloads only gives you. Actually, I sent an email to my list the other day about this, about how downloads only gives you a small picture of what is actually going on in your podcast. So I gave an example, and I'll give the example again here. One of my clients has a podcast, The Nutrition Edit, Jeannie Oliver. I love her. I love her podcast, The Nutrition Edit. She's super smart. She has super smart guests. If you are looking to get healthy, great podcast to listen to. Anyway, I was editing one of her episodes and she was talking about one of the things that you should do is literally throw away the scale, but not for the reasons why you hear a lot of other people talk about it. So a lot of times you hear it because it's like, I don't know, damaging to your mindset or because your body weight goes up and down, blah, 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 whatever. But she was just talking simply about how paying attention to the scale doesn't give you enough information of what's going on. It just doesn't show the full picture. And it made me think, and I use this example in my email as well, because it made me think about podcasting and it made me think about downloads. So with your podcast, downloads are the same as using a scale to measure what's going on in your body. So using your downloads to measure what's going on in your podcast is not going to be the thing that gives you enough information about whether you are successful or not, right? So a lot of people look at downloads as that measurement. And this is what this podcast episode is all about, is what should you be looking at then? And so the first thing that I'm going to tell you in this is that you don't know what to measure if you don't know what you're trying to achieve. So if you don't know what your goals are, if you don't know what you're actually trying to accomplish from your podcast other than downloads, then you're not going to know what to look for. You're not going to have a measurement of success whatsoever, right? Now, a lot of people, why do people even measure downloads as a measurement of success? It's just because, like, what other people do. It's because what you've seen. It's because, okay, if this podcast gets so many downloads, then they get to get sponsors and then they have money coming in from sponsorship deals or whatever because they have a lot of eyeballs, a lot of eyeballs, a lot of earballs, a lot of ears listening to their content, right? So that is why people started measuring downloads. But I want you to think about what it is that you really want to accomplish other than downloads. What is it that you're hoping to do? So, are you wanting more conversions? Are you wanting people to actually take action on your content? Are you, building this as a place in order to showcase your thought leadership so that you can get speaking gigs from it? I don't know. There's so many different reasons why you could be building this. Is you building this to be a part of the marketing of your business? That's something that's really important. So this is just a big cog in your marketing. And so it's not even really something that you measure as a standalone tool in your marketing, right? It could be that this is just a part of everything else that you do and it gets factored into the equation of your overall marketing, which is actually really smart or something that you should be, doing. But anyway, so it just depends on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. So here are some things that you could be measuring that just looking at your stats, if you open up your podcast app, your host, and look at these different numbers, here's some other numbers that could tell a different story or paint a bigger picture of what is actually going on. So here's the things that I like to track to know. First of all, I want you to know what your goals are and what you're trying to accomplish. That's number one. So you need to know that so that you know that if you are actually accomplishing your goal or not. That's number one. Number two is here's some things to look out for within your podcast host, which would be metrics that I like to dig into. So, one of the metrics that I like to look at is your unique listeners. So, your unique listeners tells a measurement of how many unique IP addresses or whatever you call it are actually coming to your podcast. So this gives you an idea of not just downloads but people who are actually listening to the show. So there is a little distinction between a download and a listener. So downloads automatically will happen if someone has a setting on their phone that's turned on that says, every time a new episode comes out, it automatically downloads, right? So then you'll look like you're having people listening, but they're not actually listening. It's just downloading in the background on their phone. Okay. So I like to measure the number of unique ones because that gives you a picture of how many people are actually in your audience. So, if you go and measure in April and you have 150 unique listeners, and then you can measure in May, and all of May you have 250 unique listeners, you know that your audience size has grown. So that's a great metric to look at. Hey, if you're listening to this and you're thinking to yourself, I really need to up my podcasting game, or you want to start utilizing your show more for your business to get more leads and sell more offers, then I want you to come over to podcastthatpays.com and check out the Podcast Collab Lab. That's podcastthatpays.com and check out what we're doing over there. I would love you to join us. Okay, back to the show. Another metric I really love to look at is your consumption rates. Now, your consumption rates you can only find inside of Apple Podcasts. So you need to make sure that you're in Apple Podcast Connect so that you can get this data. I do like Apple Podcast analytics. Most people, the majority of people, 70, 80% and upwards are listening still on Apple Podcast. So it still gives you a big enough picture, a big enough pool of data to get an idea of what's going on, even though it's not the full amount of people, because there are still people who are listening on Spotify and other places, right? So what your consumption rates tell you, and here's what I like to look at and why I like to look at them. So your consumption rates are telling you how much of your episodes people are consuming once they come to your episode. So this is a great tool and a great metric to actually see if your content is engaging. And not just to see if your content is engaging, but to see what content is most engaging. What is capturing people's attention? What is getting people to listen all the way until the end? And so this is something that you can measure, so you can go in and see different topics might be doing better than other topics. Because remember, your podcast is about your listeners and what they are resonating with, what they are liking. So this is a metric that is going to tell us if you're being successful in creating content that aligns with your people and that people are actually wanting to consume to the end, or for the most part, right? And so looking for consumption rates for solo shows, you want to really be in the 80s, 90% consumption for a solo show. And for interviews, 60% is probably a good percentage, 60, 70%, because it's usually a little bit lower for interviews because let's be honest, sometimes unless they're done really, really well, the interviews tend to lollygag around different topics, and sometimes people just don't consume them all the way through. Okay. So this gives you a good idea of how engaging your episodes are, your content is, if it's hitting the mark, if you are doing interviews, if you're seeing people drop off soon, then you know that you guys are doing too much lollygagging. You're doing too much. You're not capturing anybody's attention. No, like people aren't listening all the way through. And so that's a much better metric than looking at downloads, because who cares if it's downloaded to their phone if they're not listening to it, they're not engaged, right? Then it's not being quote unquote successful. So that's a great metric to also hang on to and be able to see what content is resonating. Like, how is this doing? And then you can make tweaks and see if that does better. Do people enjoy this? I could do a split test, or I can go in and look at my metrics and see if these Ask Angie episodes, how they perform next to my other episodes. What's the difference? Are people actually more engaged in this? Because these are like shorter to the point, I'm answering a question episodes. Do people like that? Or are people seeming to like my other content just as well? Right. So this gives you a picture of what is actually going on. And I don't know if that's necessarily, this is, gives you a picture of how to measure if my podcast is successful or not, but it's a great metric to look at to see if your content is actually landing. Okay, so the last thing I like to look at to measure podcast success, and this just goes back to number one, which is like, what are your goals? My assumption is always that your goal is to get people to act on your content, get people to convert from your content. So that would be the third thing to measure if your podcast is being successful or not. So it's not about how many people are coming. It's about what are people doing when they're coming. So are people actually taking action? Are they going to that call to action page? Do you have it? Do you even have it? Most people don't even have it set up to be able to see this information, right? But it's really important data, and it's really important to get it set up where you can have the visibility to see, hey, this week when I released this episode, on my sales page, there was an uptick of visitors, or there was an uptick from, my podcast this week with this content, or I had a higher percentage of people who came from my podcast. And I also had a higher percentage of people who converted or who got my opt-in, or I had a high percentage of people who came, but nobody went to my opt-in. So it just gives you more data. But I like to measure and see, are people actually taking action? That's probably my number one metric to measure success, because for me, success is, are you engaging people? Are they actually taking action on what you're doing? Are they wanting to take the next steps with you? Is this working as a marketing channel for you? That's what I would be measuring. And that's what I would be getting good at, looking at those numbers of, hey, people are actually acting on my call to action, but no one is converting. So then I know, hey, okay, maybe I need to go in here and change like what my offer is. Maybe this is the right thing, but you have to start collecting that data. So I hope that helps. I hope that answers the question of how do you actually measure success from your podcast. And again, if you have any questions that you want me to answer on the podcast, head over to my Facebook group, Launch, Grow, Explode Your Podcast, and you will see posts in there, or you can just ask away any questions that you have for a chance for me to answer it live. Well, not live, but me to answer it here on the podcast for you. So thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.
Hey, if you enjoyed the show, head over to podcastthatpays.com to get started on your way to creating a podcast that pays. And don't forget to follow this show and take a screenshot that you were listening and tag me on Instagram at Angie M. Jordan. I'd love to meet you and show you some love over there. Thank you so much for being here. I love you. Let's get this money.